Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first of this winter's Hope Farm webinar series. I'll just go through a few quick housekeeping things and then we'll get on. As this is a Zoom webinar, you won't be able to turn on your video or your microphone, but you will be able to ask questions using the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We have allocated some time for a Q&A session at the end, but if we don't get to all the questions, the remainder will be answered after the webinar and shared after the event. All the presentations that we're making this evening will be recorded. There is no chat function enabled for this, but if you want to ask questions, ask them in the Q&A. If you have any technical issues, we have somebody helping from the events team who might be able to help. But there was some Zoom related issues, we might not be able to offer any support. And finally, before we get on with it, I'd just like to say thanks to all the speakers and everybody else in the background who has helped produce this webinar, and hopefully we'll have a very enjoyable and stimulating evening. So on with tonight's webinar, which is titled Farming for Resilience and a Positive Environmental Footprint. We've got a range of speakers tonight. Professor Jon Storkey from Rothamsted Research, also from Rothamsted Research, Dr. Sam Cook, and Georgie Bray, the Hope Farm manager. The post-war productivity gains of UK agriculture have been accompanied by a number of negative unintended consequences for the environment, including dramatic declines of farmland biodiversity and pollution of watercourses. At the same time, in recent years, yields have plateaued, with increasing gap between the potential of new crop cultivars and the yields actually achieved in farmers' fields. This might partly be a consequence of degraded natural environment and the ecosystem services it provides to agriculture, including pollination and the regulation of crop pests. The ASSIST project has attempted to quantify the potential of these services and their providers to improve the resilience of crop yields in the context of other constraints on productivity, including things like abiotic stress, particularly climate change. At Hope Farm, we've participated in the ASSIST programme. This is a programme led by Rothamsted Research and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, looking at improving food production efficiency and remaining resilient, reducing our negative environmental footprint in farming. So without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker, Professor Jon Storkey. Jon is an agroecologist working at Rothamsted. He's a background in weed science, but is now responsible for a range of projects, all aiming to better integrate nature and nature-based solutions into commercial production systems. He was the Rothamsted lead on the ASSIST project, and he's going to talk to us now on some thoughts on regenerative agriculture. Over to you, Jon.
Thanks very much, Rob, and good evening, everybody. So bear with me while I find my presentation. There we go. Okay, so as I'm kicking off this evening, I thought I'd present some quite high-level thoughts on this idea of regenerative agriculture. It's become quite a trendy buzzword over the past couple of years, and give my personal perspective on it as a way of introducing the ASSIST project and as a background more generally to the work we do at Rothamsted on agroecology and nature-based solutions. So to start off a bit of history, hopefully most people are familiar with Rothamsted and the history of Rothamsted, but if you're not, we've been around since 1843, and Rothamsted was founded by the gentleman on the left here, Sir John Bennet-Lawes, who was a Victorian scientist. So he was he knew of Charles Darwin, and he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And the gentleman on his right is his colleague Joseph Henry Gilbert, and between them they started Rothamsted as an agricultural research station, and most importantly they set up a series of experiments on the impact of fertilizers on crop yields that are still continuing to this day. Rothamsted Manor is where Sir John Bennet Laws lived back in the 1800s. And I'm going to use one of those long-term experiments that you may have heard of, the Broadbalk experiment, as a way of summarizing how we got to where we are now in terms of modern crop production systems, and perhaps to illustrate why we may need to change our approach somewhat. So this is the Broadbalk experiment. If you have an opportunity to visit Rothamsted, you can come and see the experiment. It started in 1843 to compare the effect of different fertilizers to farmyard manure. So the long plots that you can see on the left there with different shades of green, they're the different fertilizer treatments, which originally ran the whole length of the field. But since 1926, they've been split into sections. That was primarily to control weeds, so that parts of the field could be fallowed every 5 years. And now we use those sections to look at other treatments like rotation and the effect of pesticides, although most of the experiment is still in continuous winter wheat. An important point about the experiment is it's not a museum, so we don't crop winter wheat as we would have done in the 1800s, but we incorporate new innovations in crop husbandry and agronomy into the experiment as they are introduced more generally in the industry. So the experiment becomes a really nice way of monitoring and charting the impact of changes in crop husbandry and the changes in crop production. And that's what we can see on this figure here. This is our classic yield graph from the Broadbalk experiment. Sorry, it looks a bit complicated. This is probably the most complicated graph that you'll see this evening. But on the vertical axis there, you can see grain yields, and we're around the UK average, around 8 or 9 tonnes per hectare. The blue line along the bottom there, which is the time series since the start of the experiment, is where we don't add any fertilizers. So where you don't add fertilizers, we're still getting about 1 tonne per hectare. The pink and the purple lines are where we add optimum inorganic fertilizers or farmyard manure plus a bit of extra inorganic N. And the dotted lines at the top there, the orange and the green lines, are wheat following a break crop. The other lines are continuous winter wheat. And I just want to draw your attention to 2 time periods to set up our discussion around the need for regenerative ag. And the first one is the very dramatic impact of the Green Revolution between the 1960s and the 1990s, about a tripling of yields. That was primarily driven by improvements in crop breeding. So the names that you see along the bottom there, you might recognize some of those. Those are the winter wheat cultivars that have been grown on the experiment. And Capelle d'Eprez there is the first dwarfed or short strawed variety with a dramatically higher harvest index and yield. But the thing to notice from this is that you only see that increase in yield potential when it's combined with inputs, when it's combined with inorganic fertilizer inputs, and also, importantly, crop protection products. So modern pesticides came along about the same time as the modern crop varieties in the 1960s. And they have enabled the increased yield potential of modern cultivars to be realized. And then the next striking thing, and this is already mentioned by Rob, is the yield plateau that we've observed since about the early 2000s, where we're not seeing the incremental increases in yield that crop breeders are still observing, but we're not observing them at the farm gate. And so there might be an issue with the current cropping system that we're pursuing. So this illustrates how we've become locked into simplified systems with high inputs, because that's what the modern crop varieties have been bred for. So is there a need for change? Does that yield plateau suggest that we might need alternative approaches or a different way of doing things? I've just got 3 suggested reasons why there might be a need for change, this need for regenerative approaches. The first is that there will inevitably be a limit to how much we can improve the yield of crop cultivars. So here you see on the left an old cultivar at the top, which is well over 1 metre high, and a modern cultivar down the bottom there, probably 60 or 70 centimetres. So most of the gains in yield have been won through changing the architecture of the crop and changing the harvest index. There's a limit to how much we can continue to breed for increased yield potential. Secondly, I would suggest we're losing the crop protection battle. This is a nice graphic from a recent paper from the weed group at Rothamsted, which quantified the impact of herbicide-resistant blackgrass on farm businesses. So the figures you see there are the average cost of resistance in terms of crop protection and also lost yield. And then the little section of the pie in red is the proportion, or the calculated proportion, of the overall gross profit that represents. And you can see that varies by region, because we know that blackgrass prefers the heavier clays in the southeast, and so it has more of an impact. But I think it's fair to say that we're losing the crop protection battle in terms of pests, weeds and diseases are evolving resistance to chemical pesticides more quickly, and the introduction of new pesticides or active ingredients is slowing down. And then finally, we're all well aware of the increased input prices. If we're locked into these high input systems, we're very vulnerable to increases in, for example, fertilizer prices. Rob's also already mentioned this, the unintended consequences. So they're kind of the agronomic threats to the sustainability of current cropping systems. There are unintended consequences like the reduction in biodiversity, the well-documented decline in farmland bird numbers, for example. And I like this graph because on the top there, you've got the UK winter wheat yields taken from the FAO stat website, illustrating again the increase over the Green Revolution and then the plateauing of yields. And it's almost directly mirrored by the farmland bird index graph on the bottom there. And as a plug for a new book that I was involved in on the right, that documents a lot of these declines in a range of taxa, including plants and invertebrates, as well as birds. Okay, so still thinking about the need for change, the need for regenerative approaches. So I think this is the final one in this little set, and this speaks to the issue of declining soil health. These graphs need a bit of explanation, but all you need to understand is that the amount of soil carbon that you can store in your soil is related to the soil texture. So if you've got more clay in your soil, you can hold more, capture more carbon. And so the ratio between clay and carbon is an indication of how well your soil is doing in terms of its carbon content. And we know soil carbon is important for lots of soil functions like water holding capacity, porosity, and nutrient cycling. So by using this ratio, we can have an indication of the status of soils in terms of how much of their potential for soil carbon are they currently meeting. And all you need to understand is if you're in the orange zone, or if that ratio is in the orange zone, then your soils are very good. If they're in the purple zone, their soils are degraded. And on the right there, you can see the proportion of samples from a national database of soils taken from different land uses, which are in that good or that poor category. And I'll just draw your attention to the top line there. For arable land use, you see that 38% of the samples were in the poor category, indicating that they had a lot less carbon than they really should have in them. And you can contrast that with lays and permanent grass, where much more of the samples were in the good category. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that there are some issues with our modern intensive industrialized farming systems that need to be addressed, not just for the externalities, but also for the threats they are to the sustainable production of crops in those systems. And that's what's behind a number of calls for alternative approaches to agriculture or more sustainable approaches to cropping systems. this term regenerative agriculture seems to be particularly in vogue at the moment. It's very difficult to define. Various people have tried to define it, and I've picked one out of the literature here. But we can think of it as a collection of ingredients. And in arable systems, that might include increased green cover, reduced tillage, addition of organic matter, integration of livestock, greater crop diversity, and habitat creation in livestock systems, perhaps more pasture-fed livestock, and the integration of herbal lays or different grazing systems. A lot of these will be familiar to you, and interestingly, they've been called different things over the years. And I think rather confusingly, we've got regenerative agriculture at the moment, but there's all these other terms that have been used in the past: integrated pest management, ecological intensification, sustainable intensification. And this graph here is something that a member of my team did, just looking at how different terms come into fashion and then fall out of fashion. At the moment, it's all about regen ag. I tend to think of these things as they're all the same collection of ingredients, increased green cover, increased diversification, creation of habitats, but in different recipes. And that's how I tend to think of them. But we're all talking about more or less the same collection of interventions. And that brings me on to the ASSIST project. I don't have a lot of slides on this because Sam is going to talk in more detail about what we actually did on Hope Farm, but I'll give you some background to it. And the background to the ASSIST project, it was a 5-year project with ourselves, UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and the British Geological Survey. And the big philosophy was, can we test those different ingredients of regenerative agriculture? Can we actually provide an evidence base for the contribution of those nature-based solutions, or that ecology, to the production system? So there were two big questions that the project was oriented around. Can we quantify the potential contribution of biodiversity and natural capital on the farm to the production systems? Our objective and our focus was always on crop production. Okay, always on food security and the contribution of the ecology to that food security. And then can we find ways of mitigating the impact of crop husbandry and crop production on those ecosystem services and natural capital? So can we better balance the system? Can we better integrate those ecological functions into our cropping systems? So again, you can visit the website to find the detail on it, but this just gives you an idea of the breadth of the science that we did. So we had a theme that was looking at the importance of soil health, landscape diversity, ecosystem services to maintaining the resilience of food production. We had a theme that was looking at specifically water quality and biodiversity, and how we can better balance crop production with biodiversity. The third theme is, Sam's going to talk about that in detail in a moment, about how we can test these nature-based solutions. And then theme 4 was designing systems at scale. And then finally, primarily through the team at CEH, there are a range of tools that have been produced by the project. You might be familiar with the tool eSurveyor, which is the middle picture there, which is designed to help land managers target and implement these nature-based solutions on their particular farm. And with that, I'm going to stop because I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that I can hand over to Sam in good time. So I've finished my bit, Rob. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. That's a really good, interesting start. And now I'd like to get into a bit more detail, as John alluded to, and introduce Dr. Sam Cook. Sam's a behavioural ecologist working at Rothamsted on ecological-based tactics for IPM, integrated pest management, with recent work, including that on the ASSIST programme. And Sam's going to talk now about the ASSIST Farm Network, testing sustainable intensification within real arable systems.
Okay, thanks very much, Rob. And can you see my screen? Can somebody tell me if you can see the screen? Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
we can
Right.
see it. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Assist Farm Network, which was the theme 3 and testing sustainable intensification within real arable systems. Okay, so unfortunately, we seem to have a dichotomy of farming systems that have a conflict between food production on one axis and nature-based or production, nature-based capital on the other, with high input farming, as we've heard, feeding the world, but causing some problems environmentally on one hand, and organic agriculture really looking after the environment, but not really producing so much food in comparison. So we need to really start to think about how we can use the middle ground and create win-win situations with high food production, with high natural capital in addition. So we might do this by maintaining yields of conventional systems whilst reducing the environmental impact, or in organic systems, increasing yields without further increasing negative environmental impacts. So Assist was trying to really quantify how these different methods can achieve this win-win situation. And the aim of Assist Work Package 3 was trying to quantify at a systems level the benefits of sustainable management practices that enhance these ecosystem service processes that are vital for supporting crop production. And these are pollination, pest regulation, and soil health. So at the beginning of the project, we discussed the practical interventions that we might test in our project, and we co-designed them with farmers. And some of these farmers that are sitting in this room actually became the Assist network, and we're really grateful for all of their help. They pointed out 3 main methods in which we could test in our experiments, and that was to sown field margins to support biodiversity, that beneficial insects that help crop production, including pollinators and natural enemies of crop pests that basically eat the pest and provide pest control for free. Growing cover crops, which on one hand increases biodiversity, but on the other hand helps to improve soil structure, or adding organic matter, which again helps soil structure and enhances the soil functions. So getting beneficials into the crop. So field margins are well known to support biodiversity. If you plant a field margin, you get loads more insects than if that field margin wasn't there. But previous evidence has suggested that there is a decline of these insects as you move into the crop fields. So as you can see for the ladybirds on the left, 50 meters into the crop, you see half the number of ladybirds that you do 10 meters from the field margin. Similarly, with bees, you get a decreasing number of bees as you move from the field edge to the field interior. So we decided to have in-field strips, which I'll talk about in a minute, and to really design very carefully, or as carefully as possible, a very diverse mix. In our experiments, the flowering species were chosen to benefit what we thought would attract specific groups of bees for pollination. Parasitic wasps, which lay their eggs inside aphids and pest prey and kill them, and other predators that come in like hoverflies and ladybirds that eat the pest insects. And we also included tussocky grasses to benefit the predatory ground beetles and spiders that take the prey as they drop to the ground or climb up the crop foliage and take the pests from the crop plants. So these in-field strips were intended to try to help to bring in, reduce this edge effect that we're seeing with field margins, and really bring in the ecosystem services right to the field centre where it's most needed. So we were hoping to really, have the natural enemies right in the middle of the crop where it's most needed, and not, have this absence of pests in the middle, natural enemies in the middle. We had a network of 18 commercial farms, mainly based in the southeast of England. 7 sites were monitored by Rothamsted and 8 were monitored by CEH, and CEH had another 3 sites that came into the project slightly later. And the project was run over 4 years, so 4 years of sampling from 2018 to 2021. The experimental design was the same on all of these field sites. On each farm, there was 3 fields which were randomly assigned to one of 3 treatments. So treatment 1 was the control, which was business as usual, no additions at all. Treatment 2 was supposed to support the ecosystem service processes by the addition of cover crops and these field margins at either end of the field. And then treatment 3 was trying to maximize these ecosystem service delivery, bring it right into the middle of the field by not only having cover crops and the wildlife margins at both ends, but have these infield strips in the middle of the field, plus the addition of green waste or farmyard manure for soil health. So to try to standardize sampling between the fields and the field sites, because all the field sizes were different, we decided to sample field corners. And these were very, very carefully selected, with each treatment trying to balance the orientation of boundary features. So you'll see in this example here, in each of our 3 fields, we've actually got a corner of hedgerows in the same orientation. Because these could have effects on our treatments and influence our results. In terms of sampling, this was done on a very carefully thought out spatial grid with the distance between, which is based on the distance of the infield strips. So the infield strips were placed every 96 meters throughout the field to fit in with the tractors and the boom lengths. And we sampled along the transects at sample points that were 12, 24, 48 and 96 meters from the crop edge. So this meant that we had 16 total sampling points in the middle of the field, 4 in the field boundaries and 4 in the field margins in the middle of the field. So that's quite a lot of sampling. So we wanted to quantify the background levels of biodiversity, what's there in terms of insects in total, include the key service providing taxa, so bees, butterflies, natural enemies, with a focus on service delivery, not just proxies. A lot of this work has said, right, I put a field margin in, I've got loads more hoverflies, therefore it's better. Well, what we wanted to know is, well, how many insects were those hoverflies eating? And we wanted to link those service delivery impacts to yield that we found in the crops. So we had a lot of sampling going on all throughout these 4 years. Every year we looked at the plants in the field margins, we looked at plant cover, percent sown species that were supposed to be there, and the weeds that came up that weren't supposed to be there but still providing some good stuff. We did that once a year. We looked at the plant-insect interactions that were going on in the margin by visual assessments. So we had expert taxonomists looking at the flowers and seeing if there were any insect interactions occurring on those flowers. Pest gastropods, so slugs and snails, were counted and measured. We attracted them under sources with MASH. And then we counted them, we put them in a bag and weighed them and looked at them to species after 24 hours. Looked at the weeds in the crop, particularly blackgrass, looking at the percentage cover of those weeds throughout the field. Looking for the biodiversity, so this is all about everything that's there, pests, natural enemies, pollinators. We looked at that by basically sucking it up with a Hoover-like instrument called a vortice suction sample. This sucks the insects through and collects it in a bag, which we tied up, took back to the lab, and then separated out all the insects, counted them, and identified them to species. And we recorded thousands and thousands and thousands of these species. The ground predators were sampled using pitfall trapping, so little cups were dug into the soil, filled with a killing fluid. The beetles run across the soil, fall into the pitfall trap. We collected them a week later, and again on the right you can see all of the different insects that were collected and identified from the pitfall traps. We did crop searches, so we got down on our hands and knees and we looked at 5 different plants at each of those sample points, very carefully looking at the plants, recording the number of pests and the beneficial insects that we saw. So here you can see we found some aphids on this plant and this wheat plant. Some of those aphids were parasitized, which you can see in the middle, the aphid mummies. And sometimes those mummies, like Cetobia navini mummies, were right on the awns of some of the plants. So really, really looking carefully to see what was there. Here you can see we found cereal leaf beetle pest. That's a pest at the top left. But then we've got lots of beneficial insects that we found, also evidence of hoverfly larvae, spiders, ladybirds, and lacewing eggs. To measure predation, we used sentinel prey. So it's very difficult to actually record or measure predation. So we put out artificial caterpillars. So these were 2 different sizes to kind of mimic a big fat slug and a tiny little maybe pupa as it's dropping to the ground to predate in the soil. And we put these out, and then 3 days later we looked at the bite marks that were left on these by predators that tried to eat them. As you can see, the top there, that was taken by a bird. The middle one is the bite marks of a small mammal. And the one at the bottom is the mandible marks left by a carabid beetle. Also looked at sentinel aphids. So we put 5 very carefully reared aphids with no viruses released on a leaf. We visited it 3 days later to see how many aphids were still there. Similarly, sentinel aphids, we glued them to cards and we put those on the ground or on the plant foliage. 5 aphids in a row, and after 24 hours came back to see how many had been eaten. We took soil samples to measure the soil health properties, and we looked at earthworms. This survey was adapted from the 30-minute worm survey, which is quite well known now, developed by Jackie Stroud at Rothamsted. Dig a hole, you count the worms, and we identified them into the different types that you see. So juveniles, the litter dwellers, the topsoil dwellers, and the deep burrowers. And we put them back very carefully afterwards. The yield, we hand harvested a metre area at each of the sample points, which was very hard work. And we also compared this to the yield maps from GPS enabled combines where those were available on the farms. So what did we find? This is a bit of a caveat. These are preliminary results. We have got loads and loads and loads of data over the 4 years. It differs spatially, temporally, with the different farms, the different treatments. So we're still crunching the data, but we do have some preliminary results to share. So the field and the infield margin strip establishment results, as you would expect, the sown species did come up differently in each site, and mainly according to the weather conditions at the time and the soil conditions and soil types. With the sown grasses, we got really good establishment of grasses such as crested dog's tails and red fescues, but less establishment of the other grasses like tall fescues. Of the flowering plants, again, quite a number of them established well. Yarrow, common knapweed, as you can see in this photo here, oxeye daisies just did well everywhere. Some of the clovers did really well. Unfortunately, other plants, particularly field scabious and fleabane tufted vetch, didn't really do well in any of the sites. So what are these plants actually delivering for farmers in the fields or for biodiversity in the fields? So this is a kind of a graph of the plants that we found in the margins, and the breadth of the graph of the bars represent how many, the abundance of those different plant species. And the top bar shows the number of insects that we found feeding on those plants or resting on those plants during our surveys. And so we can link these two and actually start to define what plant species are being used by which insects. And we can put together these quite complex food webs, and the links represent the number of interactions we saw, say, with the hoverflies, a very broad bar leading to the oxeye daisies, for example, and the wild carrots. So the hoverflies really liked those. Parasitoids similarly really liked oxeye daisies. Bumblebees, the Bombus lapidarius really likes kind of the knapweeds. So we can start to understand which plants are most useful for attracting the insects that we want to attract into the field that are going to perform ecosystem services for us. Here's an example of that in terms of the parasitoids and the predators. So again, hoverflies really liked these umbellifers, basically, and wide open flowers that are easy to access. In terms of predation, we found significantly more aphids that were predated on the aphid cards when they were placed on the soil surface than the plants. So the plants is on the left and the cards are on the right. So you can see that there's more aphids taken when the cards were on the ground, which you kind of maybe expected really. There's more, basically that means that the ground predators are more important for controlling the pests when they're running around the ground. Fewer of them climb the plant surface. There were significant differences between the treatments, which was really great to see. In this case, there were significantly more aphids taken on the treatment 3. So that's when we've got the infield strips, that's the blue bars, the blue lines, than the treatment 2, with just the field margins either side, and significantly more than the control. So adding these different ecosystem structures really does help. And remember, we looked at this on a spatial scale, and we found no effect of distance from the margin in this case. In terms of worms, we found significant treatment differences. Generally, there were more worms again in treatment 3 with the soil amendments, which might be expected compared to treatment 2, and very much more than compared to the control. So these really does seem to be making a difference. Strangely, we found differences between worm type with distance, which were a bit contrary. So we found the juveniles and the topsoil worms increased with distance from the crop edge, but the litter dwellers and the deep burrowing worms decreased with distance. So we're going to have a bit of think about that and what that actually means. But certainly we're finding differences, which is good. In terms of impacts in yields, so we looked at yields across all 4 sites and all 4 years in this graph, and concentrated on the cereals and Aussie rape crops. In year 1, that's the business as usual bar. So in the next graph bars, we are comparing treatment 2, which is blue, to the control, and the orange bar is comparing infield strips to the control. And you can see that as the years progress, basically the yield differential gets higher. So the sustainable management systems are having positive effects on yield. And it seems that the complex system, treatment 3, is on average the best. But it seems that it is taking time for these biological systems to respond. So in summary, we can say that there's more to sustainability than yield. Sustainable intensification shows promise, real promise, to support yields under real world conditions. And these flexible and simple options really do work. In our analysis and in the future, we've really got to think about how infrastructure cost and the run-in time before results occur affects the results and what they mean. and we have to think about the socio-economic barriers to uptake and engagement. Our farmers were actually very willing to put field margins right in the middle of the field. I was actually really surprised about that. But how widespread is that going to be? Is average Joe Blog farmer really going to do that? And we really have to start to think about trying to future-proof the farming system to enable high production and the conservation of our biodiversity in farmland. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks to our funders, and massive thanks, if any of you are listening, to our Assist Work Package 3 farmers, and to our amazing field team as well that helped to gather in all these data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's really nice to see some results coming through from that. I can't wait to read it in its entirety, but I think you've probably still got your work cut out. Now, just moving on, we're getting right down to the single farm scale now. I'd like to introduce Georgie Bray, who works for us here at RSPB. She's the Hope Farm manager, who is overseeing the farmland management, communications and advisory work, linking the farm's research to our advocacy and policy work. And Georgie is going to talk about planning habitats, placement and management for nature and IPM at home farm from the farmer's perspective. Thank you. Take it away, Georgie.
Thanks very much for that, Rob. So if I just share my screen now. There we go. Can you see that all right, Rob?
Yep, that's fine.
Good. I'll assume that everyone else can as well then. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about how we're trying to boost ecosystem services at Hope Farm, focusing on a bit on habitats and then some other things that we've got going on as well. I won't talk too much about the background behind what we are and what we do at Hope Farm. There's plenty of other places we've got online that talk about that, but we're 180 hectares and we're based in the south of Cambridgeshire, and we work with a contractor, and yeah, there's quite a small team of us on the farm trying to do what we've got in the heading here. So I'll talk a little bit about the practical side of things. And I'll start off with this, which is so a big part of what we try and do at Hope Farm is to demonstrate that looking after nature can work within a profitable system, and that looking after nature element really helps to underpin our integrated pest management work, and all works to a plan. This is the broad plan that we try and work to, and we have more than 2% of seed-rich and flower-rich habitats, because they can fit in so many places on the farm where they do actually help us do the farming. But this is a really good way of looking at a farm and using it to try and think about how your farm can work into it. And it's great to just keep this in the back of our mind to make sure that we are delivering on all aspects to help nature recover on the farm. This isn't just a plan put together by RSPB at all. There's 11 conservation organisations that feed into this plan, that's formed the Farm Wildlife Partnership. And there's a website you can get a whole load of information on managing these key habitats. But I'll just run through them all quickly. So we've got the existing habitats at the top left, which are a hotspot for wildlife on the farm. So if you can start to connect those up, that's a really good place to start. There's a wildflower meadow in the corner there. And they're looking at field boundaries, which are a great way of connecting up those existing habitats. 2% seed-rich habitat, less so perhaps well, less so perhaps from an invertebrate perspective, but that is solely for farmland birds who rely so much on seed-rich habitat, which is why that's in there. Minimum of 2% flower-rich habitat, and we've got quite a bit more of that on farm, for reasons like what Sam explained earlier, that having flower-rich habitats can provide such a good resource for beneficial insects that we want to try and connect the farm as much as we can with that kind of resource. Wet features are great not just for aquatic life, but loads of other things as well rely on water to thrive. So we've got a few ponds on the farm. That's a bit of management we did there quite a few years ago now to make more of those. And tomorrow we're out digging some old dried out ponds so that they can provide for years to come a good source of water for things in the summer, which I think this year a lot of stuff on the farm was really probably quite relieved that we still had a pond that was holding water in those really high temperatures. It's a real a life jacket for a lot of species. And then the final one is in fields, which again I'll talk about that a bit more at the end. And we've got a picture here of these assist margins going through the middle of our field, connecting those habitats. But it's about that whole farmed approach, so looking after good soil health, as well as thinking about increasing the accessibility for invertebrates, for birds, and things like skylark plots, by thinking about that whole farm system approach. So that's the broad plan that we work to. And this is what it's delivered on the farm. So we've had monitoring going right from over 20 years ago now, and our farmland butterfly index, our butterflies are still on an upward trajectory, so that's really helped deliver by providing those habitats. We've got the red line there is what's happening at Hope Farm, and the blue line is what's happening in the rest of England with the farmland butterflies. And the dashed line, by the way, that's a baseline that we set, so these are percentage change of the species we're looking at. So this is the farmland bird breeding index. Red line is what's happening at Hope Farm, and there's still that steady decline in the UK, unfortunately, in the blue, but we sit at about 220% above baseline when we started. And then the winter farmland bird index is really interesting. We haven't got a UK comparison, but that's increased by about 1,000% on average, but that really changes depending on what's going on the farm. But yeah, that's just, I hope to show you that it really does deliver for nature, having that kind of plan. Now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of the habitats that we're making and how we set about trying to make sure that, sorry, I've got a cat here who's trying to interrupt the presentation, on how we plan what's going where, and give us the best chances of establishing something that is going to make the best use of public money that we're paid to deliver these habitats, so that it is really delivering for nature. And that's taking time to plan what goes where, so that it makes sense of the farm business and for nature. Really thinking about what to plant, taking time to establish, and having lots of patience and persistence as well, I think is a common thing that we keep coming up against. So when we're planning the area of a farm, we try and think what fits best with the farm system as a start and a must. And if we're going out walking on another farm as well, trying to figure or help the farmer see what works where, we need to know what's going on in that farm as well. What crops are going, looking at what yields are in different areas of the farm. If there's some really light soil somewhere that is less likely to deliver a high yielding wheat crop, that light land could actually be really good for wildflowers because they like nutrient impoverished soil, so it's a win-win. If there are awkward corners, they can go for winter bird seed mixes and all of those kinds of things. It's about connecting the habitats across the farm as well. So thinking about making sure we've got those 6 key actions in a way that makes it accessible to nature across the farm. If you've got 300 acres, you don't want to put right up at one side your feeding resources for birds to get insects to feed the chicks, and then have your hedge that's a really good nesting habitat the other side of the farm, because that means that those adults are going to have to travel a long way to get food and bring it back to their chicks. And in the same way, Sam's and the assist research has really demonstrated the importance of connectivity for delivering for the farm system as well. So making sure that if you've got huge fields, like we have, our biggest field is 30 hectares, we want to connect that up so that it isn't just a monoculture in the middle. And yeah, planning different habitats to deliver across the species life cycle as well. So thinking about food, shelter, seed-rich habitats, but not to labour the point, but yeah, that farm wildlife plan does quite a good job of, it's a no regrets way of delivering for nature on the whole. So and if you've got lots of diversity in what you're delivering, that does quite a good job of that. I've got the pictures here just to reinforce that point. I'll start off with the map. So we've got the boundary going between these two fields that I've marked. That's actually, there's a stream going along that. And so it makes a lot of sense to have good grass margins either side to protect it. And then this bottom corner, that's awkward, to say the least, and you couldn't actually work a sprayer in up to that point anyway, so it makes sense to knock that corner off and stop creating these awkward corners, because that isn't going to be great for soil health either, and it's just not efficient. So that's why we've put a few habitats there. And then we've got these strips going through, the greener grass margins and the pink are wildflowers and the blue's the crop. So we've got the grass margins trying to help reduce nutrient runoff, but the tusky grass margins can be a great place of refuge for invertebrates over winter as well, and for caterpillars, so they can be really useful. And then we've got those that, so they're fitted in a way that fits with our sprayer widths as well. So that's a different way of thinking about planning the areas. That middle picture is just shows that slope going down to that big bottom hedgerow where we've got that stream running through it and those strips through the middle of the field. And then the far left corner, that's this grey area of the map that it was for many years, it was farmed for wheat for 7 years straight before RSPB bought the farm. But it's taken out of production. It's next to a big woodland, so it's shaded, it's very narrow, and instead it's a really nice wildflower margin with some bits scratched out for turtle dove habitat instead. So it could be a lot more useful from a nature perspective than it probably would from a cropping perspective. So that's as far as you go for planning the area. And then thinking about what to plant. So it's worth thinking about what mix. There are so many different mixes out there of what you can put in. And then it's also worth noting, actually, do you need to plant anything? If you're lucky enough to be on chalky land, if you cultivate it, you'll get some really nice wildflowers more often than not coming up of their own accord. If you're on heavy land like us, that's not going to happen. You're just going to get, or at Hope Farm, you'd get thistles and blackgrass more often than not. So you need to really think about making sure that you are not picking those worst areas on farm, or you're doing a good job of controlling those weeds and not disturbing the soil before putting that seed in, because you need to manufacture that in wildflower habitats. You need to manufacture that floral diversity and then manage it from there on in. There's a lot of good mixes out there that you can put in for winter bird seed mixes. You don't need to be really complicated. It's worth thinking about what weeds you've got there. Might decide for you on what to plant, but as long as you've got small seeds and larger seeds and a mixture of carbohydrate and oil-rich seeds in there, you're going to be delivering for a whole suite of birds. From the wild, and it's quite a basic mix that we've got on the left-hand side there, but it's delivered really well for winter farmland birds. And then the picture on the right there, that's a wildflower margin. And I've got here native species. It is good if you can to pick native species for the wildflower element, because a lot of invertebrates, they've evolved for species that have been in the UK for as long as the invertebrates have. So yeah, if you can pick native species and go for diversity as well, and think about, when you're thinking about diversity, I mean, Sam's graph that did a really great job of showing how good oxeye daisies and wild carrots and things are with those big open tops, but also thinking about flowering throughout the whole season. So if you've got things that are only flowering later on or flowering mid-season, you're not going to be delivering for things that are coming out right at the beginning of the year, like the queen bees and things. As soon as it starts to warm up in March and April time, it's useful if there are some dandelions or cowslips and things flowering in the margin to get them going as they are starting to look for food before the real bulk of flowers start to get going later on in May and June time. But yeah, with all of that, if diversity is probably the best thing to think about. There are some really good expensive mixes out there which can increase the diversity, and you wouldn't necessarily need to splash out on every margin to deliver that. But maybe pick a really nice south-facing slope where it's sheltered by a hedge. That's where it's going to really be a great place for foraging anyway. And if you wanted to splash out on a more expensive, more diverse mix even, then that might be a good place to put it. Again, this margin here, this was a more expensive mix that we had, and it had some interesting plants which we started to since find out on other margins where we hadn't planted them, so they have started to spread through natural means to the other places on the farm. So once you've figured out what you want to plant and what you're putting, getting to establishment, again, planning time. I've got pictures of really the good, the bad and the ugly here along the bottom, and they're all pictures taken at Hope Farm. Here we have to be on heavy clay soils. We have to be really careful with our soil management and what we're doing. Getting back to wildflower margin establishment again, we have to really take our time. In a stewardship agreement we've got starting next year, we've planned last year where we were going to put things and where we were going to establish new margins, and we've marked them out for establishment next year already. And that may seem like we've planned really far in advance, but the thing is, if we established a crop this autumn, we'd be harvesting in August, and we'd need to get a flower margin established in year 1, which means in August you've then got about a month or so to cultivate the stubble, get a seed bed established, get a really good flush of weeds, and get a really warm, moist soil with a fine seed bed to broadcast your wildflower seeds in. And once you put those wildflower seeds down, there aren't any herbicides that you can use to control most of the plants, particularly thistles, which could be a bit of a problem on the headlands. And that all sounds quite stressful to me, which is why we've already marked them out, and we've got those margins cultivated, and we've got some weeds that are growing that we can control in the spring and give plenty of time to get a fine seed bed. So we've got loads of time to make the most of the weather conditions we've got. So I would strongly advise to plan things 18 months advance if you can, and where you want to put them, so you've got enough time to think about it, enough time to change your mind again, and not have to worry about not having enough time to get things established before you're meant to in a stewardship agreement. When I say countryside stewardship, that's more from an England perspective, but from all things, it's just easier to take your time with it. Another thing I've got here is treat it with as much attention as a crop. You want a high yield in terms of nature delivery, so that you're going to get the best value for money, and best value for your time as well. I've got that really horrible picture on the bottom left there and where we've tried to rush something, we haven't taken all of that time, and that's what we've ended up with, where after a really wet winter. So actually when we think, okay, all right, we'll take our time and we'll put the most effort in, we've got the most out of it as well. And then what next? What next? So management all depends on how well things have gone up until that point. But we try and constantly think about what we need to improve, what we need to boost, what we might need to control, being aware of making management harder later on, so being really vigilant in knowing what we can control and what we can't. So it's worth bearing in mind, like, if you've laid out an area and planned it as a wildflower margin and done everything you can, and it's still being a real pain to manage because there's lots of weeds in it, can you actually move it to somewhere else? Would there be less hassle to do that? When you are establishing, you need to mow loads to control the annual weeds, but if they're still coming up after 2 or 3 years, then that's burning more diesel perhaps than it's worth, and there might be a cleaner patch on the farm you can put it and give yourself less of a headache. We've certainly done that before. I've got that picture, which is the same picture as what's behind me actually, of one of the assist strips that I took yesterday. So talk about what we need to boost and control. So we've got these wildflower strips and we want to boost habitat for beetles. We want to boost habitat for pollinating insects. At the moment, it's a great place for hares to hide, but hopefully it's a great place for beetles to find some refuge over winter as well, some carabids and things. We have to cut and remove our grass on our wildflower margins in the autumn and almost treat it like a wildflower meadow. And that helps to keep nutrients down and keep those wildflowers competitive against the grasses for the long term. And actually by doing that, the delivery of wildflower resources and diversity seem to just get better year on year if we get it right. But if all of that margin there was cut and removed, it would be much harder for invertebrates and beetles and creepy crawlies and things to find a place to hide over winter, and we'd lose all of that vegetation. And a lot of birds, they tend to use it as well, partridge and things, they would lose that place to hide in the field. And so we've left 2 meters width along all of these strips uncut, and we'll rotate that round as well, because that now is delivering a really good habitat. And we'll have to control the grasses a bit harder later on, so then we get into the control bit. And because there's that extra biomass on top that will rot down and maybe create a bit of a mulch, which will make it harder for wildflowers to compete against grasses in future. So next year we'll have to shift the bit that is left unmown to the other side. And yeah, you do have to keep on your toes a bit, but if you can kind of bear in mind, okay, what are we trying to improve things for? What are we trying to make sure we're not giving too much of a lead on getting away from us? If we try and keep thinking a year ahead in advance of what's going on, whilst keeping an eye on what's going on the ground, that seems to work. We don't always get it right, but that's what we aim to do anyway. And then on the bottom there, I've got rotations and staying, which I kind of spoke about, moving things around a bit, and staying within agreements as well. That's really important. We try and keep a plan each year of what our agreements say we need to do and by what points, and then we can sort of work our management to that. That's not to say be led by a stewardship agreement. We try and plan what we want to put on farm and then make an agreement fit to it. Otherwise you can end up getting run away with picking loads of things that are really tricky to manage on your farm. So definitely we try and start with what works best on the farm and what works best for the wildlife we've got, and make a stewardship agreement fit to it, and then stick to the agreement best we can as well, so we don't get in trouble. So that's mostly what I've talked about now, is connecting habitats and delivering good habitat quality around the edge. That's definitely not enough. Regenerative practices, conservation agriculture, or whatever you want to call it, John, that's what we're trying to do in field. We're making slow and steady changes, but going much more for a whole farm approach. So not just having the round edge habitats and intensive farming in the middle, but having that whole system where it's all, we're trying to deliver good soil, which should be better for the biodiversity in the soil, and in turn, hopefully be better at delivering nutrients and pest control for the crops. This is again done with a bit of a plan. So we set out where we want to be in a few years' time and then try and create steps from there on how to get to it. And this all goes back to the farm wildlife's infield elements, which is actually, I've got Agro-ecology written in there because that's such a good place to go for this kind of stuff. And then I've got 3 pictures at the bottom here. The bottom left is compost, which is one of the things we started off applying on farm and which we found delivers really well for earthworms, and can deliver pretty well for the crops as well. Has really helped us in improving the soil resilience, and seem to be pretty good in helping oilseed rape to get off the ground as well, although that's we need to do more investigating to see how that works out. And then the 2 left-hand pictures, particularly the far left, they are a cover crop that we've got established this year in one of our fields. The far right even, not left, the far right is a summer cover, and it was drilled into what was going to be winter wheat, but we terminated quite early because that corner of the field was quite heavily in blackgrass. The rest of the field grew well and we got quite a good yield off of it. But we kind of pressed the stop button on that corner of the field because it was just going to cause so many problems later on. But right, one of the issues with the blackgrass is that the soil health isn't great, so the crops aren't growing so well, so it gives more space for blackgrass to grow. We'll try and sort it out and be in a better place next year. And then the cover crop in the middle there, that's how the cover crop's growing on the rest of the farm, on the rest of that field. So there are a few grass weeds in there, but it's not too bad, especially given how dry the autumn was for us. The establishment it's doing quite good there. So that cover crop's planted to deliver for soil health, but in terms of biodiversity, it has just been humming. There's been corn bunting in there, linnets, skylarks, meadow pipits. There was loads of invertebrates and things using it, not now as it's got so cold, but earlier on in the autumn. So just to say, what we're putting in there to try and deliver on the whole farm approach for the soil, it's delivering for loads of stuff above ground as well. So thanks for listening. These are just a few places that we tend to get information from, people that have helped us to deliver that plan, and this will be shared, so if you want to follow any of those links, it will be shared after the webinar as well.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Georgie. There's obviously plenty there to talk about. We've seen right from the very broad scale with Jon's talk about quite how the unintended consequences of simplification and intensification of agricultural systems has brought us to a place where we have twin crises of reduction in farm wildlife and reduction in the services that some of the smaller wildlife can provide to agriculture. And it seems to me that the 3 talks that we've had have really shone a light on how a lot of the solutions that have been brought in for improving wildlife on the farm will hopefully have unintended consequences of improving ecosystem service provision to agriculture as well. And if we can highlight the multifunctionality of some of these things, we might see much greater uptake of them. So in terms of Q&As for now, we've got a couple of questions that have come through, but I also have one of my own. But I'll go first of all to David, who's asked a question about where the compost we use at Hope Farm comes from. Do you want to just briefly talk about compost, Georgie?
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief. It comes from about 20 miles away from the farm up at Chatteris, and it is recycled compost, municipal waste from councils and from people's green bins.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, I believe a number of companies provide this sort of stuff. It's just a question of looking around for it. It's municipal waste collection. We have many amusing stories about things that people think are green waste, including things that are painted green. My question was to Sam about the assists stuff. It's interesting that you were showing an increased differential in yield with increasing provision of marginal habitats. Do you, you may not have analysed this yet, but do you think that that increase in yield per hectare would actually compensate for the land that is taken out of production to provide the margins through the field? So a net replacement of the land lost.
Yeah, good question, Rob. And yeah, as you guessed, we haven't done that analysis yet. We know how much the compost or the farmyard manure was. We know how much the seed was. Yeah, it's quite possible we could do a cost benefit analysis. We haven't actually got socio-economists as part of the project, but we do have a lot of collaborators that are socio-economists, and so we're hoping to work with them to get at those kind of questions. Yeah, so it was preliminary data, but it's looking hopeful, and yeah, that's exactly the kind of question that we want to get to the root of.
Brilliant, thanks. A question from Jamie here. Have you found methods that reduce blackgrass the most? Either cultivations, rotational changes, and would integration of livestock grazing help control blackgrass and improve soil health? Does anyone particularly want to take that one? John.
I mean, I can quickly say all of the above. So we know that the most impactful interventions for blackgrass control are increased frequency of spring cropping, so rotations, and then integrating a perennial crop or a lay, because the Achilles heel of blackgrass in its life cycle is its seed bank. It has a relatively short-lived seed bank, declining at about 70 or 80% a year. So you can do the math. If you put a 2 or 3 year lay in, then you'll more or less deplete most of the seed bank. I think the problem we've got is in most winter wheat fields, the seed banks are so large that even if you decrease it by 90%, you're still left with a lot. But yeah, rotation, spring cropping, perennial crops, and rotational ploughing, rotational tillage. Yeah, all to manage the seed bank.
Okay, thanks. And you, anything to add, Georgie?
Just a little bit on that. Yeah, so we've used spring cropping since 2016 to help control the blackgrass on farm. And yeah, with being heavy clays, it's quite susceptible to it. There's the Achilles heel of if we've had fields which in 2017 were awful for blackgrass, and they're clean as a whistle now. Trouble we've found is blackgrass tends to thrive where the soil health isn't as good as we'd like it to be, and where we haven't got such good soil health, it's really hard to get on to drill the spring crops in a timely fashion. And we've just got a couple of fields where that's really tricky, and we're looking now at putting a lay in, because that can help with the blackgrass but also the soil health.
Yeah, that's a really good point, George. It's often, I think, a neglected part of good weed control or weed management is good soil husbandry. you know, if you look after your soils, then that helps with your weed control. Yes, good point.
Excellent, thanks. Question here for addressed to Sam. To what extent were herbicides and pesticides used across the treatments? And if so, was this based on need, and was the need different in the different treatments?
Yeah, we didn't try to impose any particular no spray policies. It was the crops were managed as the farmers wanted to manage them. We did ask them that if they did apply pesticides, that thresholds were used, particularly in treatment 3. We do have a list of what went on all of the 3 fields, on all of the sites, so we will be looking at that. But certainly it wasn't part of the experiment, and we did kind of have most of the time most of the fields were managed the same. So if one field was sprayed, pretty much all of them were.
Okay, thanks. And an interesting one here. There's an interesting take on this. Anything with the experiences of this on how regenerative practices impact on mental health and community? So is there anything that, you know, farming can be a stressful job, especially with tight margins and pest control and the like? Has anybody got any take?
I guess that Simon Wilcock at Rothamsted is kind of interested in that, isn't he, John?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, in the kind of terminology of ecosystem services, that's a cultural ecosystem service. It's a very difficult one to quantify and put a monetary number on, but it's incredibly important. And as Sam says, you know, the follow-on project to assist will be looking at other outcomes of farming systems, including its benefit to recreation and well-being. But again, very difficult to measure and quantify. But we would all like to think that these things we've been talking about would be helpful in that regard. It's certainly not going to do any harm.
I can give a perspective, again, a Hope Farm perspective on that, not quantified, but our big part of trying to farm regeneratively is trying to farm with nature, and the nature that we have on the farm, it's certainly uplifting for us to go out and walk on and see. But we have our Open Farm Sunday events. We have, as part of all of the practices that we're doing, we want to manage our hedges that are best so they can deliver best ecosystem services, and part of that includes hedge laying and all of these things we involve people and community in. And I mean, I get such a buzz from walking around that field I showed you pictures of and seeing all of the birds and everything else on it, as do the people we take out to show and people who help monitor it. But the people who come to the Open Farm Sundays and help to manage it so that it's better for all of these things, they often go away feeling uplifted as well. Not quantified, and perhaps we should be better at that. But without all of that stuff living on the farm, as well as the crops, a lot of that element might not be there.
Thanks, Georgie. Another question here for you. When you cut and remove the margins, the vegetation from the margins, what machinery do you use for the removal?
So most of the margins, they are topped and then they're turned with a hay turner, and then they're baled with a big round baler. And we've got well, now we've got our agroforestry strips as well. We've got quite a few hectares of wildflower strips, but they don't actually amount to much. We only end up with about 5 bales of that to deal with at the end of the season. But where we've started to have more complex infield strips, so we're plonking trees there as well, the strip for the wildflower is only about 3 meters wide, so it's not that much. So we're now we've been speaking with the guys over at the Wildlife Trust, and they've helped us out. They've got a flail collector. So if you imagine like the sit-on lawnmower, it's just a giant version of that. So we've got these sort of heaps of mulch going down the strips, where we can do all of that job at once. Otherwise, it would be quite messy in a narrow area. And that means we can just do it all in one pass, which when you've got something in the middle of the field and where it's not connected to the edge of the field, so we've got the headlands are intact, that's a much easier way of doing it. So they're the two main ways that we manage them.
Okay, thanks, Georgie. And another one for you. Do livestock play a role within the arable rotations at Hope Farm, either directly in terms of farmyard manure input and long-term lays, or imported farmyard manure?